And I'm gonna kick things off by tossing them a question, and then they're gonna chat for a little bit. Yeah, so the first question to kind of get things going is, what are the roots of absurdity in your practice? Have you always used absurdity and comedy as a tool in your writing? How did you kind of arrive to this?
Do you want me to start? Can you decide who has to start?
So the absurd. I think that my experience of the world has always been, from the beginning, was never one of ease and comfort. It always felt just strange to begin with that I was here, and I kind of didn't know what to do with myself, sort of a thing. My body sort of felt like this thing, and I didn't know what I was doing in it. So when I found writing in 3rd grade, I was it was an escape valve. It was a pressure valve. It was a relief. So I think that the roots of my writing are the absurd in the sense that I have always found it very strange that we exist. And I sort of feel existing has never been my first choice. And so writing helped take the edge off of that. And also I think that sort of being an oyster with sand in its shell, and so you make this pearl, I'm not calling my writing pearls, but you make this thing, pearls, faux pearls, you make this thing, or I make these things because I'm really itchy, So I think even just from the root or the motivation, there is an experience of the world as absurd, an experience of living in a body as absurd that sort of then is okay, why? I need something else on the planet to I've tried a lot of other stuff too, but most of them tried to kill me. So writing is the one that hasn't. Well, mostly.
Yeah, I was an ugly child. And in around 7th grade, I realized that I could hang out with the beautiful children if only I could make them laugh. And I think that kind of planted in, it was it was my Ben Franklin moment, and I'm this is how I will hack the system. And that kind of, has paired absolutely, with, I think that just everything messed up in the world feels really absurd. Death is so absurd. Torture is a really absurd thing. I think kind of within fiction, especially, you're just kind of able to trampoline from these concepts that really will never make sense to you, that are just these illogical foundations of life, and play with them in a way that is a little less painful, to kind of really look at and incorporate. And I remember giving kind of a short story that I wrote to this very famous author, kind of for a critique, and she was "You're good when you're funny." And I think that that's fair. And I kind of feel that way about life. It's good when it's funny. And so that's just the space that I really want to exist in always.
Yeah, I think you can, well, I guess you used to be able to, I don't know about in 2019, but I feel humor you can get away with more. And I also think humor, living on the planet, if you say things humorously, I always felt humor was sort of a self-protective measure. I can't imagine you being an ugly child, but
I have photos.
But humor, it's I'm okay. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not okay. Like, it's a way of being able to, like, safely say I'm not okay, because it's still like, I got it, you know? I got this. Because it's like the control of the narrative, which is also something that's always been super desirable to me about writing.
Yeah, I mean, it provides distance, and it's a way that you can be in pain in public that's not a bummer. You know, I think we always really have this instinct, you know, that, okay, you know, we'll be supportive of your pain, you know, for a day, right, or whatever, and then, you know, like your friends kind of want to get on with their lives, which is hard, you know, when you have chronic anxiety or depression, and humor is just a way that you can communicate kind of all of the pain you're in, but not have them ghost you.
It's like the fear, I think, of not being likable or not being enough, like, as one is. Like, I think humor arose for me out of, like, it's a defense mechanism for that, you know? It's like, I have to, like, wrap this, you know? And I also kind of feel like our blessings are our curses, you know? So it's like the same, it's not even like flip sides of the same coin, but it's just like our strengths are also like the things that are probably those coping mechanisms that are like, maybe like, well, for me, I would say it's like, not to make this into it, I haven't been in therapy in like a year and a half. It's like the longest I've gone, so like, here it is. But like, I'm like, so you guys are the lucky recipients. But it's, so like vulnerability, I guess. Well, it's also, okay, so in the writing process, like, my sort of process is like, I dictate. When I'm not writing poetry, I dictate, and I just want it to be, I encourage it to be a mess. Like, I dictate, I don't, even if like I use Siri, and even if I see some of the words coming out wrong, I don't correct. Like, I need to give myself that permission first draft for it to be a shithole. So like, maybe there's some humor, but like, it's really just like super raw. Like, kind of the person that like, if they called on the phone, you'd need to set a boundary. And then the edits are where like, I sort of wrap it, you know? And that's when like, I'm like, all right, well, someone else is gonna be receiving this. And so I think sometimes the humor comes in first round, but it's like humor definitely comes in the editing process, I think, because it's like, well, like, how can we make this more something?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, I think that while the absurd doesn't inherently need to be tragic, I think the tragic is definitely inherently absurd. You know, there's just this element of why and senselessness to tragedy. And I mean, I think that, you know, you kind of spoke about how writing is like the least destructive coping mechanism, right, you've encountered. And that's kind of really been true for me too. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to get into sort of like a drug-like state without drugs. There's this one like Russian toy commercial on YouTube. It's like from the 80s, and it's this like doll where if you submerge it in cold water, it like breaks out in measles. And my daughter got in this phase, she doesn't speak Russian, but where she would just watch this kind of on a loop. And I realized, you know, that if I like only slept about 4 hours a night, kind of which I was, you know, doing at that time, and then I watched this video, it sort of took the absurdity of it, kind of like pushed me into this space where sort of like the pain of realism couldn't get me for a second. And I think that that's very, very much what urges me to write, in particular. You know, my poor, like, super Catholic mother, you know, is always like, you know, sending me kind of, you know, like chicken soup, you know, for the super religious, austere soul. Books, and is like, you know, why can't you write this, you know? And like, there's definitely times, you know, when I go to see, you know, like a movie about like puppies where like really bad things don't happen, where I'm just like, okay, it's been like 2 years since I tried to sell out, and write something, that's not completely bananas, and it's just like mainstream, let me try it again. And it always just really fails because it's not why I'm turning to writing, I'm really turning to it for that kind of like acknowledgement and ability to work with the absurd and kind of have it acknowledged and really make myself laugh. Do you make yourself laugh when you're writing?
I mean, sometimes. And then I'm like, okay, this is good. Like if I can make myself laugh, yeah. Yeah. Like I have this, yeah. And also, I was just thinking about like coming from like a poetry background, like what you were saying about like the tragic and the absurd. I feel like coming from a poetry background, I sort of always felt like, in some ways, like metaphor was like more real than the thing it was trying to describe. And so like in the editing process, like I'll be editing something and I'm like, is this true? Like I always ask myself, is this true? Is this true? And it's not like a reality truth. Like it's not like, could this happen? In fact, a lot of times when I try to remain loyal to like the way things happen, the writing's really shitty. But it's like, is this true on like a bones level? Like, and often when something is true on a bones level, it's something that, like a merman is more real than like some bro, like for me in that experience, or like an Orthodox, a Zoftic Orthodox woman who a Reformed Jewish woman falls in love with a Reformed Jewish woman with an eating disorder falls in love with, like the woman is like, it's more true that she is a golem, a mythological figure, a Yiddish mythological figure, than, at least to this other character's perspective, than she is just a woman, because I especially feel like also with love, I mean, we both write about romantic obsession a lot. And with romantic obsession, it's like, how real is anyone that we're ever obsessed with? Like the way we see them, is it ever like as they are? And I mean, in your work, can you talk a little bit about that? About like the sort of the place of romantic obsession, I mean, at least in your novels.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it is. I don't know. At least in my, it's difficult because I've kind of only ever treated love in like this drug way.
That's the best love. I mean, no offense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like it'll fuck you up, but
it did, yeah. And there are some mistakes, just kind of in like the global life trajectory, that I've certainly made because of it. But I mean, I think to me, like it really does kind of boil down to obsession for characters. And I mean, not only kind of for your character, but for yourself. Finishing a novel, it's such kind of a Herculean task of monogamy, really. I mean, to work on this one thing for so long. And, like any monogamous relationship, I think to do that, you really have to find ways, to keep making it exciting, to you. If you're not obsessed with it, I think it's like not enough to like it. That's something kind of I always tell my students, as they like begin to like work on some big project. I'm like, if you aren't shrieking, like bananas over it, you haven't quite found, right? Like just the spark of it yet, because like that's gonna be the nuclear energy that will make you, be able to write the first draft and then do like 6 edits of it and, not get that sick, like when you see it kind of in final form. So I feel like it's really important to lean into obsession. And for a long time, I felt that wasn't the case. Like for a long time, I felt like, oh, I don't want to get pigeonholed, like I don't want to only write about these certain things. I'm not gonna write about death and existential terror. And so I did the story, and then an editor called me and was like, hey, we loved that story you sent us about death and existential terror. And I just kind of realized that's my thing. And if I took that away, I would kind of also be taking away just the drive that makes me make, bad life choices in favor of writing. So for better or for worse, I think it's really important that we as writers are obsessed and that our characters are obsessed. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, the drug like love. Okay, so when we talk about absurdity and fantasy, I feel like there's something that a lot of people learn when they're 13, which is why a love that doesn't exist or is from a distance or is gonna kill you, feels better, dare I say, than the person you buy toilet paper with every day. Why? But that is a question I have grappled with so much. And I feel like writing is a place to not only address that question, but also to not destroy my life. I can kind of just do that in the work. But it's weird because a lot of most of the art that I value, most of sort of the love affairs are love affairs that if you were at a therapist, they would be block his number. And so it can be very confusing as someone who confuses fantasy and reality as to why these why these grandiose, high stakes loves are the ones, I guess they're the ones that most inspire, even if they also are the maybe maybe the ones where then have to avoid. And so I think that, I don't know, writing is sort of a safe place for me to live in a fantasy world, because I found that when I try to live out all my fantasy, or it's it doesn't look like I thought it was gonna look.
That's so true.
Yeah.
That's so true. I love that concept of it as a safe space for bad decisions, and also kind of a way to think through and kind of vicariously, do the thing. It feels really fun, I think, to do the wrong thing, to make the wrong decision. One of my writing teachers had this quote that I just love. We were talking about this case where a guy had a secret family locked in his basement, right, in Austria. And I'm do you really think, do you think it's possible, kind of, that his spouse didn't know? And the teacher was everyone knows everything all the time. And I think on different levels, that can be true or not true, but I do know that for myself, absolutely, the most fascinating thing for me about all of the terrible decisions that I've made, just the whopping mistakes where you're just how, what were you thinking, that really are absurd in the most bold-faced type. I knew that it was bad, but that pleasure, of just kind of doing it in the moment and sort of the short-term thrill of it was something that I just chose not to override. It seemed so magical and generative to me in a way that, the rest of life didn't, and was kind of this form of escapism, and I've read a ton of, boring self-help books, to try to deal with this, and done, 15 years of work. However, it's still such a compelling argument to be thrilled. So I think that never really goes off the table. But if you can do it in writing, that can maybe take the edge off. It's like the Nicorette gum of bad decisions.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm chewing it right now.
Can I confess something to you in public about nicotine gum?
Mm-hmm.
This is so gross. So just when I talk about bad decisions, I feel like the overwhelming need to prove to you, that I'm not lying. So let me tell this story. You may not speak to me ever again. Yeah, you won't. So the first time I met you, we were in your car, and it was a very nice car. And you offered me a piece of nicotine gum, and I had never tried it before, and I hadn't smoked in so long. And so I put it in, and I'm a real chomper, and so I really went at it. I really did a canine, chew toy thing on it, and probably squeeged all the nicotine out, and chewed. But we're driving, and a few seconds later, I'm just I am going to shit myself in Melissa's car, in her really nice car. And I was it got to the point where I was about to tell you, that we needed to do something. I hadn't formulated the plan beyond that. But then it was this weird cold sweat broke at the last second. And I was so glad I didn't say anything. I guess so I could say it here today.
So
Nothing came out. But it was
afterwards,
close.
we went to the wasteland to look at vintage clothes. Did the shit ever happen?
It was just eventual, but no, it just
You
went.
could have told me.
It went into just sweat and fear. There was some shaking that I tried to keep low key, because I figured you'd cut the friend date short if you noticed, that I was shaking really, really hard.
Oh my God, no, I prefer my friends to be shaking. I actually do. I love when someone else is having a panic attack, because then I'm I don't have to have one.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Should we do questions?
Yeah. Should we take some questions from the floor?
I'll bring a mic if you have a question.
Hi. I actually have a two-part question. I guess the first part is, what do you both think makes something absurd? And the second question is, what's the opposite of absurdity?
Are you a deep thinker?
I guess.
Yes. I feel like there's a Lush bath bomb, whose product description could completely clear this up for us.
I mean, I can only speak from my experience living in the world, and I don't even think this is the stuff I write about. Actually, maybe it is. No, I think it is. But I feel like the stuff that, when I see people like a family, out on a Sunday, peacefully enjoying life, seemingly not addressing the fact that it's strange that we exist, and that they have reproduced. Kind of the most, the less weird something is, not weird, but just the more sort of, the more something, and again, this is I always thought I was non-judgmental, because I'm really busy thinking about myself, but then I realized I actually am judgmental, and I think that it's this will spark my judgment. When something, the more sort of, to me, unquestioning something seems, the more that there is acceptance of whether it's the physical world, whether it's law, whether it is one's own sort of perception, that the weirder, the more absurd that is to me. And the more absurd that makes me feel. But then I'm also like, that is so weird. Like, how are you just like, okay? And like, sometimes I get depressed by it too. Like when I see families, like I'm just like, ooh. Like, no offense, Alissa as a child. But I guess when I write about absurdity, it's not usually like, I don't do like a character who's like, I don't do like the Raymond Carver thing where it's like a character who's like in a family, or like a, I don't know, or like the Lawrence Ferlinghetti thing where it's like in Golden Gate Park and like you sort of feel the two layers. Like one is that they're just like living life and the other is that like they're about to like scream, but they don't know. I don't really do that as much. It's more always from like the perspective of someone who feels like they are observing normalcy, and that is like, and they are very aware that they feel like shrieking within. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And the thing I really love, I love Gulliver's Travels so much, and that like made an impact on me really early on. And the thing I loved about it was just it kind of showed sort of like the difference that perspective and magnification and amplification can make. You know, just how like if you know, like you take sort of a person who's attractive to you, but then like you know, make yourself so small that you're like inside of one of the pores on their nose, then like they're gross suddenly. You know, that like anything can be, you know, gross sort of if looked at closely enough. And I kind of feel the same way about absurdity. You know, I feel that sort of like there is an absurd angle to everything. You know, that maybe sort of like it's less a state or sort of like a description than it is kind of a path. You know, I feel like there's an absurdist path, you know, to sort of seeing everything. And what that takes into account, you know, is sort of the implausibility, right, of kind of whatever it is you're describing, which is implausible, you know, for a variety of ways. I mean, just all of us, you know, being in this room, you know, on this date at this time, think of all the things that had to happen. Yeah, so I definitely feel like it's a trajectory, like I choosingly, willingly take, kind of in my writing to pick apart the absurd in a situation. And I agree, like realism is absolutely the most absurd. Yeah, sometimes it's too painful. Yeah, that's when I go to like fabulism, but often realism. Yeah, what is the opposite of absurdity, do you think?
I think like when, like if, well, for literary wise, I would say when I'm reading something and I'm just like, yes, especially with a dead person. You know, like that feeling when you like reach across and you like hold hands with the dead writer. That to me is like when I feel the least absurdity, because there's like and it can be in something that's totally absurd. I was just reading these short stories, those Haruki Murakami short stories after the quake. I like loved the earthquakes. I know that's so weird, but you know, it's just like getting high without drugs. And so I read this book of his short stories, and there was like, I mean, some of it was definitely like what one might call absurd, like, you know, I mean, talking animals, right? But I felt so like I felt like, and he's alive, but I felt like we don't even speak the same language, but I felt like he was like, I actually listened to it on audiobook in my car, and I felt like he was like whispering right into my heart or something. And that's when I feel like the most sort of like at peace on the planet. So even if something is absurd or strange, it's like, there's a human connection, right?
I kind of feel like I actually I'd never thought about this. So this is a very new answer that I just came up with. There may be some big holes. I'm just putting it out as a first draft, okay? I feel like the opposite of absurdity is fantasy, because in fantasy, everything is the way that it should be. And I feel like Absurdity really looks at the horror of the way that it actually is. Right?
More questions?
I had a question about, Melissa, you said something about like a shithole first draft, and Alissa, you said like the first draft can be really mundane to get through. Do you guys have tips for people maybe trying to get through a shithole first draft?
So, I mean, for me, it is really fun to think of it as like a fear and loathing in Las Vegas, like tight, like go to a Super 8, like stay up for 7 days, like finish it, I just sort of go on this bender. It takes me a lot longer, but you could get a really, like depending on how large the whole of shit was, like you could do it in 7 days. But I mean, for me also a huge thing is I don't edit until I get done with the first draft. Otherwise I would never finish. It's just like sort of like throwing the dynamite behind you, and like run, and do not look at like the horror or the damage, in your wake. That's like for the second draft.
So I'm totally on the no editing while doing it. When I lived in New York and I wrote poems, and I would always write on the subway, and then when I moved to Los Angeles I started dictating in my car driving around because I couldn't like text and drive or like write poems. I text and drive like occasionally, but I couldn't like write poems and drive like on 405. So and my line breaks disappeared, and that was how I started writing prose. It was like completely the geography, like so I started writing these essays. So I wrote the So Sad Today book. And then after I was done, I was going to write some more poems, and I felt like I was writing the same poems over again. And I was sitting on the beach in Venice, and I had this idea, this like merman came to me, and this whole thing, and I was like, but I can't write a novel. Like I was like, because as a poet, I never understood how you, like why, not just how, but like why you would do in like 300 pages what you can do in like 3. And so, because poetry, it's like all about the condensation. So one of my biggest challenges as a prose writer is generating like enough text then that I can sculpt. Editing and sculpting is like, comes very naturally to me, because as a poet, that's like, you're working with such a small canvas. But I have to make the clay. So like Alissa, I really just try to like shit out my clay. Like I'm just like, and I do mine by dictation, and instead of doing it like all at once, I do 3 paragraphs a day, and I found that to write a draft, if you write or dictate 3 paragraphs a day without editing, just go, and like literally my first round of edits is trying to figure out like the translations on Siri, because she gets half of it wrong. But I don't correct it as I'm going, like nothing. Even if characters' names are spelled wrong, I see it, I just keep going. But I do 3 paragraphs a day, and I found that it takes about 9 months to a year to get a full first draft, writing only 3 paragraphs a day. But I do it, you know what I'm saying? Like I do not miss a day. And then it's like, for me, then it's like editing is more relaxing to some extent. It is, because it's like it's because you're not coming from blankness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do want to piggyback on that really quick and say I think that I do believe like ideally like consistency is great. But I'm a wildly inconsistent person, and just like in writer culture in particular, like that was like a long held like deep secret of mine, that like I didn't write every single day, but like the days like I did write, I would write a lot. I had a friend who was like, just like try to think of it, like it sounds like weirdly like pervy, but like touch it every day, like the project, like even if you're not working on it, even if you're just like opening the file, that contact then, impacts your thoughts, and you may sort of like then kind of have an idea like later as you're, doing dishes or, that kind of you wouldn't have had if you hadn't kind of made that contact every day. So I agree that that's ideal, but I do also want to say that it's okay to be a binge writer too. Maybe it's not, but I'm talking to myself, and I declare it to be okay.
You guys are amazing. I was just wondering, is there a character or story that you're sure you will not create but wish you would?
That's a great question.
That's really good.
Ooh. I can tell you about like one spectacular failure. So I was trying to write this fabulous story. This is like an idea from like 15 years ago, but every so often I'm like, I've just not found the window for it yet. But so there's like a 7-year-old girl, and like suddenly her hair turns to blood, but it's not her blood. It's the blood of these victims of this very particular genocide. It doesn't go well on the page for me, like as I sort it out, but maybe one day. But that might just be one of those things where I'm like, I would love to read that story by someone who could do it.
Well, okay, so when I just finished this most recent book, Milk Fed, I wrote 2 novels, and my agent and I decided to take one of the novels out to sell. And so I got it all ready and worked for like another 9 months and edited it, and then right before we were about to take it out to sell, I realized it was the wrong novel. So then I ended up getting this novel all ready to sell and took it out, and sold that book. So I don't know what's gonna happen to this other book, and it's a full fucking, like, years of work. And I'm gonna be curious to see. Right now I always was like, I'm not gonna write short stories. I just was like, well, I'm not a novelist, and then I started writing novels, and I was like, well, I'm definitely not a short story writer, and now I'm writing short stories. And it's like, but so I don't know if, and I also have another idea for a different novel, so I don't know what's gonna happen to this book. And if you had told me, like, I remember there was this one moment where I was like, had been editing it for like days, and if you had told me like, actually, everything you're doing right now is gonna go in a drawer, I would have been like shocked and chagrined. And it was like a really bumpy road to like get to sort of what was the right next thing, But I think that there are things that like, from the get-go, like it was third person. I don't know that I meant to write third person, maybe, but I don't know, like it was quieter. And I think that's why at first my agent was like, well, let's go, like let's show them you can do quiet. But like, maybe I'm not supposed to do quiet, So I guess more will be revealed with that one. And also things that don't have sex in it. Because like, I feel like I'm like so tired and done with writing sex, but like yet I'm still writing sex, so I don't really know.
Yeah, I wrote 2 novels also that are in drawers. And I feel like I just have to sort of...
I want to read them.
No, you don't, is the funny thing. I don't think anyone should read them. I have to think about it as like scuba diver certification or something, right? It's like I'm logging hours, and those hours absolutely contribute, to your mastery and your skill and like what you're able to do in the future. And so, I think like that's also kind of such a great thing about writing is, I think you do become a different writer because you do have to keep it interesting to yourself, So yeah, like a book without comedy, you know, or like a book without like sex. I can't really imagine it, but like I don't want to say, you know, like maybe I'll get to a point where that's the most absurd thing to me ever, you know, in a great way, and that'll be so appealing.
Yeah, like I was like, I never want to hear myself like be like he moaned in her mouth like ever again. And like literally like this story I'm writing like today, it was like moaning, you know.
I would just title the next book.
The moan.
He moaned in her mouth.
He moaned in her mouth.
I also, for a long time, I had this one writing teacher who's like, never talk about your works in progress, invent a fake novel, you know, to tell people. So I got this like novel, I'm like, well, it's set in an Applebee's. And then like I started like making it increasingly upset, you know, and like it kind of got to the point of detail where like, I just really fucking want to write this Applebee's novel, you know? So I mean, I think you can also, it's like sort of like in gymnastics, like on the bars, you know that thing where it's like they go all the way around? You know, I feel like bad ideas, sometimes if you just like hang with them long enough, although this was like my approach to like my first marriage and that didn't go that well, but sometimes I do feel like they can actually swing around and reverse and like go into the good.
Hi guys, thank you. I just wanted to backtrack just a little bit, but the state of mind that you guys are writing from when being in the obsession mind feels different for me than when I'm emulating being back in that same state of mind once I'm out of it. Do you trust what you're essentially writing, which are the same words, as having the same effect, or do you doubt them? And how do you feel about that?
It's a great question.
I think that's another like place where the difference between drafts is like really helpful.
Yeah.
Because it's like I don't know, there's some like dumb like Goodreads quote about like inspiration, but I like it. And it's like about how like we don't have time to like wait for inspiration as a writer and as like a working writer. Like writers write, like a cow makes milk and that's just what we do. And so there can be inspiration where we write our way into inspiration. It's like having sex in a marriage, you know, like you rarely feel like it, but you have to do it. And then by the end, you're like, all right. It's kind of, that's my experience of writing. But so I think that even if like, sometimes like the first draft, sometimes there are like points of drudgery, like especially with a novel like the ligaments, like writing a fucking ligament, because when you have an idea for a novel or like a theme, you know, or like an experience that you want to tell, I don't know, I never think about the ligaments. Like I'm like, oh wait, I have to move this person from like this point to this point. And sometimes you can be like doing a ligament for like days and it's just like, I did not sign up for this. And you sort of don't feel that same spark that you maybe felt when you started the project, or even that you were maybe trying to exercise from yourself, like of an experience where you really felt lit up like that. And I think that's when it's just like the doing. And it's like, so with a first draft, it's like, don't even think about whether it's inspired. Like just like, it has to come out. And then like, you can like deal with that in the edits. I think with my last novel, like the one that I just finished, I probably rewrote every sentence. Like I'd say like 85% of the sentences got rewritten, you know? But it's like a ship. It's like, you know that thing with it's like a ship and like over time, different parts of the ship like fall off until like, and are replaced until like the whole ship has been replaced by new parts. But like, it's kind of still the same ship, you know, even though like every part has been replaced.
But it floats.
Hopefully.
I also find like that sometimes can inform my decision about point of view, you know, because if that is that I might bow out at first, you know, in that case, because sort of like, right, describing, you know, kind of, an obsessed person from kind of like that distance is one thing. But I also, you know, think kind of as you were saying, like what's literally realistic isn't always the most emotionally credible. I think that really applies, you know, to writing, and sort of like the ways that you evoke the feeling are slightly different. And I see this all the time, kind of it's fascinating to read first-person fiction where a character is drunk, and sort of like the different choices people make. And sometimes like it goes really poorly on the page, because it's like this reliance on like slurring, and sort of like a description of like vague shapes, right? And kind of the ones that are the most realistic have this kind of like impressionistic effect, right? And sort of like the words themselves aren't that altered, but the sort of descriptions, or what that character's perceiving is altered. So I think that that's kind of a good place, as you were saying, in revision, where I really sort of like play around with that, of sort of, what is going to give the effect that I want the most. And sometimes it's like the more dialed back version. Yeah.
That was a really good answer.
Any other questions?
Hey, thanks. This is for both of you, but especially Alissa. I was curious what you think the sort of importance and value is in humanizing like the evil, absurd characters, like Tampa, which I'm still fucked up over in the best way.
I'm sorry.
No, I love it.
Yeah.
I like made everyone I know read it, like The Ring.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's like a messed up thing in me. Like when I see something like awful, or like have like a bad thought, it's like I want to tell someone else, like a virus of just, it's a really sort of bad selfish impulse in me of just like, don't make me be alone, right? Like with this terror. But I mean, for me, I think that is really kind of like the key to, I don't know, I don't want to sound like incredibly pretentious, but I'll say like I deeply believe that that's linked to progress. I think that there's something dishonest, not in terms of kind of like, people who are in pain, but in sort of like in the theoretical land of kind of, calling sort of like another human's actions evil. That there's, it's really complicated, and that there's so much that goes into kind of who we are and, what decisions we make, what decisions kind of we feel able to make, what decisions are available to us. And context just matters so much. One thing I do a lot of times with my students is kind of have them think of like the very worst thing that they think that their character would do, and write about, like the context that they do it in. But then I come back the next week and I give them like a really, really bad thing, just like escalated, to a horrible degree. And I try to make them think of the context in which it could be plausible, in which a reader might believe that this character actually might do this. And I think that to me is interesting. What do you think about it?
I was just thinking, I mean, that's really cool. I'm like, I want you to escalate my writing. I think about what, well, I think philosophically I really resonate with that like, to sort of when we divide the world into, like, for me, art is nuance, especially as a poet. It is about the weave. It is the darkness and the light contained in one poem, right? And that a poem can ask a question and not answer it. That is why I love poetry, that it's asking the question. That is the point. There is no point. There is no, like, answer to be gleaned. It is, like, going deeper into the question. And so I think in terms of, like, human morality or goodness, or kindness or evil, like there is definitely something to be said for seeing the nuance of a character. And I also always think about, like, when my middle school theater teacher, she had us watch the movie The Bad Seed, and like she's like, Rhoda doesn't know she's bad. And I think it's pretty rare, like I think that in cartoons, you know, there are a lot of people who delight in their evilness, you know, like Gargamel delights in his own badness. But I think as a human, there are different ways we delight in our badness, and it's usually much more veiled to ourselves. Like we don't even know, you know, which is why I also feel a lot of, I have a lot of questions about like moral authority and like purity and like goodness, because I'm just, I don't know, it feels to me disingenuous to not look at like oneself first, you know, and be like, ew, it's ugly in there, before being like, garbage, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think that there's something too with like accountability and responsibility, you know, even that evil kind of by steps, you know, or passes over. You know, where if something's evil, it must be destroyed. You know, and I think kind of like the harder question is yeah, kind of what created, right? What created this? How can, you know, sort of like the set of behaviors, you know, or actions or thoughts, you know, that we're labeling as evil, you know, like is there a way, you know, to yeah, like is there a way to respond to the conditions that are creating that?
I think evil's a great place to end. If you
Definitely.
Thank you both so much.